The distress signal came from the Keth homeworld. That was the first wrong thing. The second wrong thing was that it was inhuman. Not translated. Not decoded. Raw, unprocessed human standard, broadcast on a frequency humans hadn't officially used in 40 years, since the Keth had destroyed the last human relay station in the outer margin, and the Confederacy had simply stopped transmitting in that direction. Commander Yusult Mar heard it at 0317 station time, when she was the only officer awake on Resolute, and the night shift crew were the kind of tired that makes people honest. "Play it again," she said. The ensign at comms, Petrov, 19 years old, still had the slight hollow look of someone who'd grown up on a ration colony. Played it again. "This is Dr. Anselm Rook, Xenolinguistics Division, Confederate Survey Corps. If anyone is receiving this, please do not respond. Please do not come. I am." Static. Timestamp. Mar asked. Petrov checked. Checked again. 16 years ago. Mar looked at the star chart. Keth Prime. Deep in contested space. 16 years ago. The war had been at its worst. The Keth had been winning. Everyone knew it. Even if the Confederacy's official broadcasts had cheerfully described every human retreat as a strategic redeployment. 16 years ago, every human in the outer margin had either evacuated, surrendered, or died. Anselm Rook had done none of those things, apparently. "Why are we receiving it now?" she asked. Petrov shook his head. He didn't know. Mar didn't know either. That was the third wrong thing, and somehow the worst of all. She convened a command meeting at 0600 with her senior staff, crowded around the briefing table in the kind of exhausted, unwashed state that real emergencies always produced. Lieutenant Commander Son Adissa had coffee. Chief Engineer Tam Yolanda had a headache. Dr. Priya Osei, their xenodiplomatic specialist, nominally aboard to assist with the ceasefire negotiations they'd been en route to for 3 weeks, had that particular expression she wore when the universe was about to make her job significantly harder. "The signal is authentic," Mar told them. "Signal's intelligence confirmed it before I woke you. Rook's biometric voice pattern, Confederate encryption, 16-year-old carrier wave. Someone on Keth Prime has been holding that signal in a buffer for 16 years and just released it." Silence. "That's not how Keth technology works," Osei said carefully. "No. Keth don't archive human communications. They consider human language, linguistically, philosophically, beneath the threshold of signal. They've never even formally translated standard. The entire diplomatic exchange during the war was conducted through intermediaries." Osei paused. "If the Keth had that signal, they wouldn't have kept it. They'd have deleted it." "So either it wasn't the Keth who kept it," Adissa said, "or the Keth are different from what we think they are." Osei looked at the star chart the same way Mar had, 3 hours earlier. "Or both. Our course takes us within 4 light hours of the Keth system," Mar said. "The ceasefire negotiations are in 11 days. We have orders to arrive in a diplomatic posture, make no provocative moves, and under no circumstances deviate from our assigned corridor." More silence. "So we're not going," Yolanda said. Mar said nothing. "Commander." Adissa leaned forward. "If someone survived on Keth Prime for 16 years, inside Keth space, during an active war, that's not just a rescue situation. That's an intelligence situation. That's a history of the war situation." "I'm aware. The negotiating team needs to know what?" "I know." She knew. She knew all of it. The problem was she also knew that Resolute was a diplomatic carrier with minimal armament, that Keth Prime was 40 hours from their position at maximum burn, and that her orders did not include investigate mysterious transmissions from alien homeworlds. Her orders also hadn't anticipated this. "We hold position," she said. "We transmit the signal to Confederate command, and we request instructions." "Transmission lag to command is 9 days," Petrov said quietly from the doorway. She hadn't noticed him arrive. He looked faintly apologetic. "Round trip 18 days. Negotiations would be over before." "I know the math, Ensign." She didn't mean to be sharp with him. He flinched anyway. "Thank you." Dismissed. He left. Mar stared at the star chart. "Someone on that planet sent us that signal," she said. To no one in particular. Or someone released a signal they'd been keeping. Either way, it's meant for us. Right now. Not in 18 days. She paused. Someone wants us to do something, and they timed it so we couldn't ask permission first. Which means, Osei said slowly, they knew we'd come. They burned for Keth Prime at a compromised velocity, faster than their diplomatic orders permitted, slower than maximum burn, the kind of speed that said we're interested, not aggressive. Whether the Keth could read that distinction, no one was certain. Osei thought they might. The Keth had a sophisticated understanding of approach vectors and what they implied. It was one of the few things xenodiplomats had learned about them with any confidence. Most of what humanity knew about the Keth was architectural. The shape of their ships, the configuration of their weapons, the temperature ranges they favored in their interior spaces. You could learn a great deal about a species from how they built things. And what humans had learned about the Keth from 40 years of war was that they built with extraordinary precision. Every curve calculated, every surface optimized. Nothing wasted, nothing decorative. They were, Osei had written in her pre-mission briefing, a civilization defined by the elimination of error. Mar had thought, reading it. And then they met us. Humanity was very good at error. It was almost a survival trait. 16 hours into their burn, they received a second transmission. This one wasn't 16 years old. It was on the same frequency, in the same voice, and it was live. I see you coming, said Dr. Anselm Rook. Good. Don't stop. I have approximately. A pause. Something murmured in the background in a language that made Osei sit very straight. 30 hours before the High Clave reconvenes. You need to be here before that happens. He's alive, Petrov breathed. Rook, Mar said into the open channel. This is Commander Yusult Mar, Confederate vessel Resolute. Please confirm your status and location. A delay. 7 seconds. Then, location. The Contemplation Quarter, Keth Prime. 3rd terrace of the recursive hull. Status, guest. Another pause. And Commander? Thank you for coming. I wasn't certain you would. Rook, are you in danger? The longest pause yet. That, he said, is an extremely complicated question. The ceasefire negotiations your vessel is en route to, the ones that have been 40 years in the making, are going to fail. I know what the Keth are going to say when they reconvene the Clave, and I know what your negotiating team is going to say in response, and I know exactly what happens after that, because I've watched this process 3 times already. Mar looked at Osei. Osei had her eyes closed, processing. What the Keth want, Rook continued, isn't something your negotiators know how to offer, because no human being in 40 years of contact has understood what the Keth actually are, including me, until about 8 months ago. A sound that might have been a laugh, dry and tired, especially me. I spent 16 years here before I understood. Rook, Mar kept her voice level. What are the Keth? The sound came again. Definitely a laugh. Frightened, he said. Just completely terrified. The whole time. Every single day of the war. They received him, 31 hours later, via a Keth transit shuttle that approached Resolute without weapons signature or evasive patterning. The Keth equivalent of hands raised. Mar was in the docking bay. She'd brought Osei and Edissa, and against regulations she'd brought Petrov, because he'd been on shift for the signal, and she had a vague feeling he'd earned whatever this was. The shuttle's external design was what she expected from Keth architecture. Precise, optimal, every surface exact. The interior, when the hatch opened, was different. It had been modified. The walls had been altered to accommodate something softer. A padding of woven material in dark colors, a shelf with objects on it, a space that was clearly meant for a human body to spend time in. 16 years. Someone had made him a home. Anselm Rook was 63 years old by the manifest she'd retrieved. He looked neither older nor younger than that. He looked like a man who had spent 16 years in genuine adjustment to something no other human had faced, which left him composed in a way that felt earned rather than trained. He was thinner than the archival photos. He moved with a slight favoring of his left leg, old injury, unaddressed. He was wearing Keth clothing. Those clean, optimized lines, but in a fabric that had human modifications at the cuffs and hem. He looked at Mar, and his face did something complicated. You look like someone who ran all the math, he said. And then came anyway. The math suggested I couldn't wait for authorization, she said. He smiled. It looked like it hurt slightly. Yeah, they timed it that way. To see what you do. The Keth timed the signal release. Yes. Osei took a half step forward. The Keth chose to release it. Why? Rook turned to look at Osei, and something in his expression shifted. The look of a man encountering a question he'd been waiting to hear. Because the signal was the test. Holding it was the test. Releasing it was the test. Everything they've done in 40 years of war has been a test. Petrov, quietly, from behind. A test of what? Rook looked at him. Whether we're worth the fear. They gave him a conference room, because it felt less clinical than a medical bay, and Osei wanted to hear everything without interruption. He drank the coffee Petrov brought him. 3 cups, steady. And he talked. The Keth, Rook explained, were not at war with humanity. They never had been. The thing the Keth had been doing for 40 years, in every engagement from the first margin encounter to the Sorrento station bombardment to the systematic dismantling of human relay infrastructure. All of it was documentation. Documentation. Ma repeated. They're archivists. Rook said. At a civilizational level, everything they do is about permanent, accurate record. Their entire philosophical framework is built around the premise that the universe contains finite events and that the highest function of intelligence is to record those events without distortion. No bias. No narrative. No error. He wrapped both hands around his 4th cup of coffee. They've been recording us since first contact. Everything. Every battle. Every retreat. Every decision we made. They wanted a complete record of humanity. That's not what a war looks like, Odessa said carefully. From their perspective, it is. They don't have the concept of war the way we do. Conflict as a means to an end. Territory, resources, surrender. They have a concept that roughly translates as stress documentation, introducing a crisis, and recording how the subject responds. They've done it with 4 other species. He paused. The other 4 species all failed. The room was very quiet. Failed how? Osei asked. 2 of them surrendered. 1 of them retreated and went dark. No further expansion. No further contact. The last one counterattacked with everything they had and... He stopped. They're not around anymore. Mar set down her coffee. The Keth destroyed them. The Keth documented the event, whether they caused it or it was a cascade of the species' own decisions in crisis. The record is ambiguous, which the Keth consider, he made a face, acceptable. They don't distinguish between recorded events they caused and recorded events they didn't. It's all just data. That's monstrous, Petrov said. From a human framework. Yes. Rook looked at him without judgment. That's exactly the word I used, about 3 years in a conversation that nearly ended very badly. The Keth don't have a category for monstrous. They have a category for inaccurate. What bothered them about my reaction wasn't the moral content. It was that I'd used an imprecise term for a precise phenomenon. He paused. That was the first time I started to understand what they were. They can't do ethics, Osei said slowly. They can do logistics. They can track consequences with extraordinary precision. If you document carefully enough, you can predict outcomes, and over time prediction becomes a form of ethics. They know that destroying a species produces a certain kind of record, and they find that record. He searched for the word, low information. A species that destroys itself under pressure tells you very little. They prefer species that don't. Odessa leaned back in his chair, the particular lean of a man reorganizing his entire understanding of a 30-year war. They wanted us to survive. They needed us to survive. There's a difference. Rook set down his cup. They needed us to survive their intervention, and then adapt, and then do something they hadn't predicted. That was the test. Every time we did something unexpected, every time human behavior produced a data point outside their models, they paused. They recalibrated. They didn't understand, and not understanding was deeply uncomfortable for them. We confused them, Mar said. Constantly. The pack bonding especially. They have individuals who are interconnected, a hive-adjacent structure, loose consensus rather than hive mind. But they don't have what humans have. They don't have the thing where a soldier runs back into fire for a person they've known for 2 weeks. They documented it 1,147 times before they decided it wasn't an error in their records. He smiled, and for a moment she could see the xenolinguist under the 16 years of modified circumstance. The man who'd found something so strange and beautiful he'd forgotten to leave. 1,147 times. They kept looking for the rational explanation, the strategic advantage, the hidden calculation that made running into fire make sense. It doesn't, Petrov said. No. That's what they finally had to accept. The act is not rational. The impulse is not strategic. Humans do it because they love people and they can't not. He looked at Petrov with something like precision. Do you know what that is, to a species whose entire framework of value is built on accurate documentation? To encounter a behavior that is fundamentally undocumentable? You can record the action. You cannot record the inside of it. You cannot capture it in data. It just keeps producing, and what it produces, you cannot predict. Silence. That's not frightening, Odysseus said carefully. That's all. You said they were frightened. Both. Rook looked at his hands. They're the same thing, for the Keth. Dr. Priya, Osei asked for 12 hours. She needed to prepare. She took Rook's testimony, all 7 hours of it by then, because he had 16 years of material and the ability to talk like a man who'd had very few conversations and found this one almost physiologically relieving. And she read it and reread it, and slept for 3 hours, and woke up and read it again. Then she sent Mara a message that said, I know what to say. I need you to trust that I know what to say. And I need you to let me say it without a prepared script, and without a fallback position, and without a translator. Mara wrote back, that goes against every diplomatic protocol we have. Osei wrote back, Rook says the Keth have records of every diplomatic exchange humanity has ever attempted with them. They've read our protocol. They know when they're being managed. A pause. Then, tell me what you need. What Osei needed was 12 hours and an arrival that announced resolute clearly, openly, at sub-evasion speed, with full sensor transparency, effectively naked. No military posture, no defense protocols, nothing that the Keth could interpret as managed presentation. And then she needed to walk into the Keth High Clave with Rook beside her and say something that wasn't in any diplomatic manual, because no one had ever understood the Keth well enough to write the manual she needed. Mar gave her the 12 hours. The recursive hall was everything Rook had warned them it would be. And still Osei found herself unprepared. The Keth were not what she'd imagined. She'd known the biology, insectoid adjacent, bilateral symmetry in 3 planes, communication through a combination of pheromonal and tonal signal. But the documentation didn't capture the quality of their stillness. They occupied space differently than humans. They held themselves in a kind of perfect readiness that, if you weren't expecting it, read as frozen, as wrong. The gallery of the High Clave held 47 of them, and every one of them was absolutely, completely still, in the way that only something alive and paying very close attention could be. Rook walked beside her and was visibly, to those who could read him, relieved to be back. That was its own kind of data point. The High Clave senior arbiter. The concept was roughly analogous to a chief archivist, the Keth who maintained the primary record of all documentation, turned toward Osei with that perfect, predatory stillness and produced a tone sequence that Rook murmured was the formal version of, You were not expected. No, Osei said. I wasn't part of the plan. You already have a record of. I'm something new. Rook translated. She watched the senior arbiter process it. I know why these negotiations are going to fail, she said. I know what you're going to say. And I know what we're going to say in response. And I know you've watched this happen before with other species. I know we look, from outside our behavior, like the others. I know we've been retreating and fighting and making decisions under pressure for 40 years, and you've been recording all of it. And I know that none of it has given you what you need. The arbiter produced a longer sequence. Rook was quiet for a moment. Then, he says the record is complete. The documentation of human stress response is comprehensive. The negotiations are the final phase of documentation. What does the final phase produce? Rook listened. Acceptance or refusal of continued contact. And you've determined in advance which will produce. Based on prior records of analogous species. Osei looked at the stillness of 47 Keth, and thought about everything Rook had told her. 1,147 instances of inexplicable behavior, the confusion and the fascination, and the 40 years of documentation of something the Keth couldn't file correctly because they couldn't understand it. Then I need to give you a data point outside your models, she said, before the formal session, before you run the protocol. The arbiter waited. What do you know about why Dr. Rook stayed? A long pause. The arbiter produced a sequence that even Osei could tell was uncertain, fragmented, incomplete. Rook translated quietly. He says they have extensive documentation of Dr. Rook's behavioral patterns over 16 years. But the causative data is... He stopped. He's using a concept that translates roughly as a hole in the record, a space where the data should be and isn't. Yes, Osei felt something cold and clear settle in her chest, the specific sensation of understanding exactly what needed to be said. We call that love. Rook went very still beside her. He stayed because he wanted to understand you. And wanting to understand someone, in human experience, is a form of caring about them. And caring about something, about a species, about a mystery, about a 40-year question you can't answer, does not require that the thing cares back. It doesn't require strategic advantage. It doesn't require accurate documentation of mutual benefit. It just is. She kept her voice steady. You've been documenting human behavior for 40 years, and you have never been able to predict us, because you don't have the category for the thing that makes us unpredictable. We do things for love. We run into fire for people we've known for 2 weeks. We build communities with beings who are nothing like us because we're curious about them. Because curiosity is also a form of love, and we can love things we don't understand yet. She paused. Dr. Rook stayed because he fell in love with a question, and the question was, what are you afraid of? The silence in the recursive hall was a different quality of silence than she'd heard before. 47 perfectly still bodies, and something changing in the stillness, something she couldn't name but could feel, a shift in the quality of attention. The senior arbiter produced a sequence that was longer than anything she'd heard from them yet. Rook listened. His face did the complicated thing again. He wants to know. Rook said, very quietly, if you're afraid of them. Osei thought about it. Genuinely. The way she'd learned to genuinely think about things, rather than producing the diplomatic answer she'd been trained to produce. Yes, she said. Terrified. I've been terrified since I read Dr. Rook's testimony last night. You're nothing like us. You think in ways I can barely model. You've watched us for 40 years, and you've done damage, real losses, real grief. And I don't know if any framework I have applies to you. She held the senior arbiter's gaze as steadily as she could. And I came anyway. I came because I wanted to understand you. Because the answer to fear in human experience is very rarely retreat. She paused. We have a word for it. Curiosity. The thing that made us climb out of our gravity well and go looking for whatever was out here. We knew it might be terrible. We came anyway. She stopped. Let it sit. The arbiter produced 3 short tones. Rook translated. He says, that is the first response in 40 years of documentation that we do not already have a record of. And then the stillness broke, not loudly, not dramatically, but completely. 47 bodies shifting in a way Osei would later describe as sighing, except that side wasn't quite right. Released wasn't quite right. The posture of something that has been under pressure for 40 years and has just encountered its first opportunity to change was closer. Ask him, Osei said. Ask him what they were afraid we were. Rook asked out a long sequence, and then Rook was quiet for several seconds, the quiet of a man reorganizing his own 16-year understanding. He says, Rook said slowly, they were afraid we were like them. Osei frowned. Like them. Efficient. Precise. Optimized. His voice was unsteady now, in a way she hadn't heard from him before. They were afraid that if they let us expand, if they allowed human civilization to reach its full scale, we would outdocument them. We would record everything, precisely, completely, with no error, and the universe would become a fully documented place. And then, he stopped. And then what? And then there would be nothing left to be uncertain about. He looked at her. They're terrified of certainty. A fully known universe is, To the Keth, a dead universe. Their entire civilization exists to keep the record incomplete, to ensure there's always more to document, always more that's unknown. And they looked at humans, at how fast we move, how fast we adapt, how thoroughly we categorize and name and classify and label, and they thought we were going to fill in all the gaps. The silence was very large. We're the opposite of them, Osei said. No. Rook shook his head slowly. That's what they thought we were. What we actually are is, we're the reason the gaps exist. We go into things we don't understand, and we make them stranger. We add complexity. We introduce variables. 1,147 acts of irrational devotion. 40 years of behavior that didn't fit the model. He looked at the senior arbiter, who was watching them both with that perfect, changed stillness. We're not their opposite. We're their safeguard, the thing that ensures the universe always has something left to be uncertain about. Osei turned back to the arbiter. Then you need us alive, she said, and we need to stop losing people to a war that was always a test. She kept her voice careful and clear. Tell me what you need to change that. What followed was 11 hours of the most demanding conversation Osei had ever conducted. Rook translated without pause, running on something that was beyond caffeine, the specific energy of a man who'd spent 16 years waiting for this conversation to become possible. He was extraordinary. She'd worked with translators in 4 different diplomatic theaters, and she'd never seen one who translated effect the way he did, who could carry not just the words, but the emotional texture of what the Keth were communicating. The difference between a sequence that was curious and a sequence that was urgent and a sequence that was, in Keth terms, something like vulnerable. The Keth were willing to end the conflict. They had been, Rook clarified at the 7th hour, willing to end it for approximately 9 years. The difficulty had been finding a frame that both species could inhabit, an agreement that acknowledged what the war had actually been, which wasn't something either side had previously understood. The agreement they reached wasn't a ceasefire. It wasn't a treaty. It was, Rook eventually translated it, a joint documentation project. The Keth would share their records. 40 years of human behavior, documented with perfect Keth precision, filtered through 16 years of Rook's guidance toward a format humans could read. The complete record of everything humanity had done under pressure. Humanity would share theirs. Everything they'd observed of the Keth, incomplete, misread, filtered through terror and grief and 40 years of misunderstanding. Not accurate, not precise, but human, which meant it was the thing the Keth couldn't produce on their own. An inaccurate record. They want our biased records. Adissa said, when Osei sent the summary back to Resolute. They want our perspective. She sent back. They've never had a record from inside. They've only ever documented from outside. They want to know what it felt like. A pause. Then Adissa again. That's going to be devastating to read. For both sides. Yes, she sent. That's the point. Mar was in her quarters when the formal agreement was signed. The Keth used a process of chemical documentation, a substance that changed composition in the presence of mutual agreement, something that could be falsified only by a species that didn't value accurate records, which no Keth would ever be. She had Rook's full testimony on her screen, and she was 3/4 through it when she hit the section she'd been dreading. The losses, documented with Keth precision, filtered through Rook's translation. Every human death in the 40-year conflict, recorded accurately, named where nameable, contextualized where context was available. The Keth had records of people Mar had served with, people she'd written letters home for, people whose names she'd added to the memorial wall in the Resolute's chapel, pressing each plaque into place with the particular care you reserved for acts that needed to be done right because no one would undo them. They hadn't died in a war. They died in a documentation project that their own civilization hadn't known was happening. That was the thing that could have made her furious, and did make her furious, for approximately 40 minutes, alone in her quarters, with the fury of someone who'd attended 41 funerals and needed somewhere to put it. But underneath the fury was something else, something that took her a long time to identify. The Keth had records of every one of them, every person on that wall, not just the act of dying, the act of living. 40 years of documentation, people who'd been grieved inadequately, recorded imperfectly by human institutions overwhelmed by loss, were in the Keth archive with a completeness that no human institution had managed. Adissa knocked on her door at the 4th hour. She'd been crying for a while by then, which she didn't try to conceal, because Adissa had been her lieutenant commander for 6 years, and the performance of composure was not something she owed him. He sat down across from her and looked at the screen. 41, she said. I know. They have all 41. I know. Complete records. She pressed the back of her hand against her mouth for a moment. They got complete records, and we got grief and guesswork and a wall of plaques and whatever I could piece together to send to their families. Adissa was quiet for a moment. Can we request copies? She hadn't thought of that. The agreement was mutual documentation, which meant access, which meant she could, formally, within the terms of the agreement that Osei was still finalizing, request that the Keth provide their records of 41 specific individuals. Yes, she said. I think we can. Then we do that. He looked at her steadily. We do that, and we take the records home, and we do the letters again. With everything. Mar looked at the wall of her quarters, which was not the wall in the chapel and didn't have plaques on it, but she could see them anyway. Yeah, she said. We do. Petrov found Rook in the observation deck at some point past midnight. Ship time. An arbitrary designation given they were in deep space. But humans kept track of midnight because humans needed sleep, and the thing that preceded sleep and the ritual of calling a period of rest a night. Rook was looking at Keth Prime, which was still visible as a point of light from this distance, a small, cold brightness in the cluster of stars humanity had named the margin, and the Keth had named in a concept that translated as the location from which the record began. Petrov sat down. He wasn't sure why. He was 19 and had been on shift for most of the last 3 days and had watched things happen that he'd be trying to explain for the rest of his life. Were you scared? He asked. Rook glanced at him. The whole time. 16 years of scared? That's what curiosity is at the start. You're scared and you want to know. The scared part doesn't go away. He gestured slightly. You accumulate enough wanting to know that it outweighs the scared part. Most of the time. Petrov was quiet. Did you ever try to leave? 3 times. Rook looked back at Keth Prime. The first time I got as far as the transit staging area, and one of the junior archivists followed me. Not to stop me, just because they wanted to document what I was doing, and they couldn't do that from a distance. He almost smiled. Someone following you because they find you interesting enough to document it's a strange thing. I went back. The second and third time. The second time I made it to the shuttle, and I sat in the shuttle for 6 hours trying to decide, and I realized I didn't actually know the answer to something, which is a state that I find it very difficult to leave. He paused. The third time I was genuinely going to go, and the senior arbiter, not this one, the previous one, who died 3 years ago, came to the transit bay and produced a sequence I'd never heard before. He stopped. What did it mean? Rook was quiet for a moment. It didn't translate. That's the honest answer. I've spent 13 years since then trying to translate it, and I don't have a word for it in any human language. The closest I can get is something like, he thought, like the thing you feel when something you've been afraid of turns out to be worth the fear. When you're on the other side of the terror and looking back at it, and what you feel is not relief, but something harder to name, something that's partly I understand now, and partly I couldn't have understood before. Petrov thought about that for a while. I want to be a xenolinguist, he said. After this tour, I want to study the Keth language. Rook looked at him. It'll take your whole career, and you won't finish. I know. You'll be scared the whole time. I know. Rook smiled, and this time it didn't look like it hurt. Good. That's the right answer. The negotiations concluded at hour 19. The formal exchange, Osei signing for humanity, the senior arbiter undergoing whatever the Keth equivalent was, happened in a room that smelled like the Keth, which Rook had told her was a complex of mineral compounds and temperature-calibrated air that she might eventually find pleasant if she spent enough time around it. She didn't find it pleasant yet. She found it arresting, in the same way that things that were deeply unfamiliar were always arresting. The sensation of the brain insisting that there is information here you don't have yet. After the formal exchange, there was a pause. The senior arbiter produced a sequence. Rook translated. He says the documentation of this event will be the first record in which a human being is listed not as subject, but as co-archivist. Osei looked at the arbiter for a moment. Ask him, she said, what they're going to do now that they can't be afraid of us anymore. Rook translated, waited, translated back. He says, they intend to find something else to be afraid of. There are many more species. The universe is very large. Osei laughed, surprised, which was rare for her in professional contexts. Tell him that's very relatable. Rook told him. The senior arbiter produced a sequence that was, Rook confirmed, the Keth equivalent of laughter. It didn't sound like human laughter. It sounded like something else, something structured and rhythmic and profoundly alien. It was, Osei would write later, the best sound she'd ever heard. Not because it was pleasant, because it was genuinely, incomprehensibly other. And she understood just enough of it to know that she didn't understand it at all, and that she would spend the rest of her career trying to, and that somewhere in the vast documentation project the Keth were running on the universe, that pursuit had already been assigned a category. She didn't know what the category was called. She thought she might spend a long time finding out. Resolute departed Keth space 12 hours later, carrying 3 things that hadn't arrived with a formal agreement. A man who'd spent 16 years accumulating the understanding that made the agreement possible, and 41 records that Commander Yusul Mar had requested personally, formally, under the terms of the documentation exchange. The records would take months to translate fully. The Keth's documentation was dense, precise in the way that only something non-human could be precise, cataloging details that human record-keeping had never thought to include. Atmospheric conditions at the time of death, the behavior of nearby human beings in the moments before and after, the physiological changes in Keth observers who had been present. The Keth observers had noted something in 41 different instances, a physiological response in themselves that their documentation classified as unresolved stimulus reaction, an incomplete processing event, something that did not conclude. It was only Rook, reviewing the records with Mar and Edissa on the second day of transit, who identified what it was. They were sad, he said quietly. Every time. He looked at the line of documentation. They just didn't know what to call it. Mar set down the record she was holding. They were sad about people they were killing, Edissa said, in the flat tone of a man processing something that didn't fit any frame he had. They were sad about losing data points, Rook said. Every death was a hole in the record, an event that would no longer generate new events. He stopped. They grieve incompleteness. I knew that. I didn't know until right now that what they were experiencing, every time he stopped again. I've been here for 16 years, and I'm still finding new holes in my own understanding. Mar thought about the 41 plaques and the 41 letters and the 41 faces she'd tried to remember accurately, imperfectly, with all the bias of grief and memory. Good, she said. Both men looked at her. That means there's more to find, she said. Isn't that the point? Outside the viewport, Keth Prime had reduced to a star among stars. The margin was exactly as it had always been, cold, vast, containing more than any record had yet managed to capture. Somewhere in the recursive hall, in the contemplation quarter on the 3rd terrace, a junior archivist had added a new entry to the documentation of humanity. The entry read, Subject departed, record incomplete, expected to continue. It was, in Keth reckoning, the highest possible assessment. They were, in human reckoning, looking forward to whatever came next.